Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Joan Wages. I am President and CEO of the National Women's History Museum. We welcome you here this evening. We are delighted to be in partnership with George Washington University, particularly the History Department and the Women's Global Institute, and we are just delighted to be partnering on a series of forums. Tonight, the title is New Beginnings, Immigrant Women and the American Experience. This is the fifth in a series of discussions of initiating change and adapting to change, all very important in our world. Catherine Schulteis with GW is here this evening, so again, thank you so much. We would like to thank our coalition partners who have joined with us to support this evening's event, the American Association of University Women, the Junior League, the League of Women Voters, Nancy Tate is often with us, the National Association of Partnerships in Equity, the National Conference of Puerto Rican Women, Carmen Delgado, Voto Delgado, sorry, and Mana. And a special welcome to Marga Fripp and Empowered Women International. I know that there are a number of supporters here. And of course, to our wonderful panel, Dr. Donna Gabaccia, Ms. Diane Portnoy, and this evening's moderator is NBC4 Washington anchor Barbara Harrison. I'll briefly tell you about these distinguished panelists. Dr. Gabaccia is from the University of Toronto. She came down this evening to join with us, is a scholar of international immigration, gender, and food studies. She has written and edited 15 books on U.S. immigration and immigration in world history. And she is currently working on a book on the feminization of international immigration. Diane Portnoy has founded the Immigrant Learning Center in Malden, Massachusetts. She too flew down to join with us. And she founded it in November 1992 to provide free English classes to immigrant and refugee adults. Under her leadership, the organization has grown from 3 classrooms serving 60 students to a nationally recognized education center that serves more than 900 each year and educates the public about the positive impact immigrants have on the American economy and communities. And then, of course, our moderator, Barbara Harrison, is a News 4 midday, NBC4 Washington, D.C. anchor, and she also reports the weekly segment Wednesday's Child, which features children available for adoptions. She made a television journal of her own pregnancy to motivate women to seek early prenatal care, and her goal was to help decrease the extremely high infant mortality rate in the Washington, D.C. area. All 3 of these women have been bestowed with many honors, so we are just very honored to have them here this evening. I would just like to say one thing before I turn the program over to Barbara, is that I'd like to make it clear that tonight's discussion is not about immigration as a hot-button political issue. Rather, the focus is to explore the historical challenges faced by women who immigrate to the United States and the impact that they've had on our contemporary society. And also, we ask you to put November 20th on your calendar, 6:30, to join us again for our next forum, which will be entitled Breaking In, Women and STEM, Then and Now. So thank you again for joining us this evening, and the program is yours, Barbara.
Oh, thank you. It's so nice to see that so many people got here in this weather. I was thinking maybe we might see 3 or 4, but we'd have a party anyway, no matter how many came. I was also just thinking as she said that you must have gotten that off the website about my having this following my pregnancy with a journal. That's been a while. That daughter that I had of my 4 children is now in medical school here at GW. Anyway, but she would like to know that she was mentioned. It's so nice to be here. The topic is a very interesting one. I have been given the questions that they, as professors, probably know people often ask, but I have asked them, and they've agreed that if you have a follow-up question, please don't hesitate to raise your hand, and I'll signal you, and you speak up so that I can hear, because I usually wear an IFB, we call it, in our ears, so I can hear the director talk, and they talk all the time. So my hearing is not as good as it should be, but if you speak up, I'll be able to hear, and I'm sure they'll hear you just fine. But let's start with Donna, and she has given us a few questions to get us started. Diane has a few too, and we'll sort of mix them up and hopefully go away understanding a little bit about women and immigration in this country. Can you give us a broad overview of the women's participation in migration to this country? Because most of us think that women, at least in the past, came along with men and never on their own.
Well, women, of course, have been part of every period of migration to the United States. Even in the period before independence, the colonial era, the women were part of the labor migrations. They were a very significant part of the coerced migrants who came as slaves. And they were indentured servants looking for jobs as well. They were part of the refugee migrations. In the 19th century, women migrated on their own to seek work, but they also, yes, they did migrate together with men to settle on the land. Women migrated in search of factory jobs, to reunify families. They sometimes came alone with children, even in the 19th century. Over time, of course, the backgrounds of those women changed, as did the backgrounds of immigrants to the United States, shifting from Northern and Western Europe to Southern and Eastern Europe and Asia, and to today, when the majority of migrants, of course, come from Latin America and from Asia, and increasingly also from Africa and the Caribbean. So women have been part of every migration. They've been motivated by a desire for labor. On some occasions, they've been motivated by a desire for adventure. They've accompanied men. They've preceded them. They've followed them. They've worked and labored in very large numbers, and changing jobs, of course, since the U.S. has and its economy have changed substantially over time. I've always been puzzled that we're only interested in women when they come by themselves. Even as members of families, women work, and they work for wages, and even as mothers, women work, and that work shaped immigrant communities, made them resilient and important places of both resistance and cultural change. So whether women were few and on their own, or whether they came with families and in large numbers, it's worth paying attention to their special responsibilities as workers, as mothers, and as members of communities.
But as percentages go, were more men coming over the years?
There's been a really
history?
interesting shift. In the 19th century, there were probably 2 migrant men for every migrant woman. And then beginning around 1920, that shifted. And women became half of all migrants, and they continue to be half of all migrants to today. And scholars, including myself, are still trying to figure out why that shift happened. It's related to the labor market. What kind of labor was demanded in the United States in the 19th century? Many of the jobs and the demands of building industries and railroads and construction, those were male jobs. Today, of course, the expansion of service work, the expansion of helping professions have created large numbers of working opportunities for women. Again, whether they come independently or whether they come with families. But women today are 50%, and in some years a little bit more than 50% of all immigrants entering the United States.
So Diane, I was
just going to add to that, and historically, if you look at different ethnic groups, I just want to add, Eastern Europeans, for example, when they came over, you would find that during the 1800s, the men would come. Sometimes they'd go back and forth. The men would come. And then later on, the women would join them. But Irish women, during the potato famine, they were hungry. They had nothing to eat. Women would come.
On their own.
On their own. And they would come and they would do domestic work. And eventually they'd stay and their children would become teachers, for example. Jewish women. Jews came as families. And that was also unusual, I think. So it differed by different ethnic groups if you looked at it historically. Today we're finding, I think because we have so many restrictions, although you're saying it's half and half, but still, if we look at it by entrepreneurs and some of the research we've done, we're seeing a little bit more men than women actually. At least when we're dealing with entrepreneurs.
One of the theories for the so-called feminization of migration, that shift from 1/3 or 40% women to 50% women, has to do with restrictive immigration laws and the privileging of family unification as a way of getting a visa. And women are more likely to take advantage of visas for family unification than are men. It's also a fact, Diane, and I think you're pointing to this, most of the professions today that are singled out for work visas are male professions rather than female ones. And that has an impact on the ratio of men to women from group to group. So you'll find fewer women among Mexican migrants, for example, and among South Asian migrants, and more women among Latin Americans and Europeans.
So what are we saying to, you all aren't going to need me, I can see that right now.
I just want
to, you know what, I know that because they know what the questions are. I'm following but go ahead.
Go ahead.
No,
and then you'll have a chance.
Say because it's much more of a conversation.
You know, even legally, initially we had open immigration when the country started. And we always think of limiting immigration to the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. That's when people start thinking that we started to limit immigration. But the reality is that it was limited before that to something called the Page Act. And that limited women immigration. And they were trying to exclude, quote unquote, women prostitutes. And that was the first, really the first. And then we started, then we really started limiting immigration as we got into the as we got into the 1900s.
When was the Page Act?
It was before 1882.
It's 1875.
Why don't you explain what an open and closed immigration policy is for those who may not know what that means?
Well,
would you like to do that?
Okay. Some people have described the immigration policy of the United States today as a door that is half open. Throughout the 19th century, the United States, like most of the other countries of the Americas, wanted new population. They imagined that the West and the indigenous people were disappearing, and they wanted European origin populations, women and men, to replace them. And the United States is, like many of the countries of America, described as having an open door in the 19th century. That door gradually was closed, that's one way of thinking about it, until it's now half open, and we have numerical limits on the numbers allowed to enter the United States since the 1920s. The other way of thinking about, however, and I think this is the way I prefer, is we have a sifting policy. We try to create a colander or a strainer that have the right shaped holes to admit desirable immigrants and to exclude undesirable ones. And how we've defined desirable and undesirable has changed over time. In the 19th century, undesirable was largely seen in terms of Chinese in racial terms and as Asians. Today, undesirables are often seen in terms of class and educational status. So if you are a person with low levels of education, you're seen as undesirable, despite the fact that the U.S. economy continues, of course, to generate huge numbers of jobs that demand and are open to workers with limited education.
So as you look at this, is our immigration policy more open toward men or women with the same educational backgrounds?
It's a good question. You know, we unfortunately, we have visa limitations.
So there's 10,000 visas available to people without high educational standards, right? And those go largely to men. The United States today prefers and many people are advocating opening the number of visas for high-tech workers. Those will go largely to men. And if you look at professions that have been signaled and singled out for, they're in the STEM fields, they're in medicine. The only female profession that has been identified as a shortage of workers and therefore open to foreign-born women is nursing. And many Filipina and Jamaican women entered the United States
Well, I don't
under
know about
those provisions.
where you work, but where I work, if there's something wrong with our computer, we get on the phone, we dial a 5, 6, 7, 8, and somebody comes on from India or from the Philippines or somewhere else, and almost always it's a woman. So there are women who are getting very high skill.
But I also want you to recognize in this country, there are over 20 million women in this country, immigrant women and children. 25% of them have bachelor's degrees or higher. And of those that are working, about 15% of them that are working, about a third of them are professionals. They're in managerial positions. A third of them are in the service economy. 25% of them are in retail trade. So they're in all levels of the economy, and we very much need women in the economy. They're entrepreneurs, and they are very much in the healthcare sector. They take care of our children. They take care of our elderly. So the need is there, as Donna was saying. We do need them. Unfortunately, there are not enough visas. There are certainly not enough H-1B visas for people.
But is it true that nurses can come from anywhere? We need nurses in this country.
We do need, absolutely, we need nurses.
And people in the medical profession.
And if you look at the demographics, we have an aging population. Immigrants are the ones that are having children. They are replenishing, and women are the ones that have children. And they are the ones that are, they are replenishing the population. Immigrants that are come in are of working age, and they as you were saying, they keep the economy going. Yes, nurses are vital. They're the doctors.
But interestingly enough, from what I have heard, doctors have to be retrained when they come here, or they have to go through some sort of medical experience. It might take 2 or 3 years to be certified to work. But with nurses, it's not the same.
One very noticeable pattern, this is today, that I've read about, is that in fact we're not making good use of women's education as immigrants. An extraordinarily high number of women who take jobs as nannies and childminders and elder care workers have been trained as teachers and nurses and doctors in their own countries. They may have limited English, or they're struggling to acquire proficient English. They must recertify themselves professionally in the United States, as in many countries around the world. But there's a kind of downward mobility that's part of the immigrant experience, which we don't always
unfortunately,
talk about.
it's not just women. I mean, people need English language skills. That's almost the number one. Once an immigrant comes to the country and they find a place to live and they have some food and some clothes, language is so necessary.
Why do most women come to this country today? Why do most migrate to this country?
Well, they come for women have come for a number of reasons, as Donna had said initially, and always have. Most are coming for family reunification. But you also have professional women that are coming today because the United States represents opportunities that they do not have in their own countries. And they come for educational reasons. So it's for all the economic reasons. Some women come because of the horrors in their own country. They're escaping abuse, they're escaping wars. I have stories from my school of some women that it's just heartbreaking. The wars that they've escaped, poverty. So it's all the same reasons that women have always been coming to this country. They come today. I think the one difference that I find today is that there are more educated women coming into the country today that are looking for opportunities that America provides that they have not had perhaps in the past, and the opportunities that we provide today.
Yeah, I think it's very clear that in the 19th century, the typical immigrant man, like the typical immigrant woman, was a person with 3 to 6 years of education who anticipated working, if it was a woman, in domestic service, in industry, sometimes in the case of the women in industry until they married, and then again after their children grew up. Today, women are more likely to be educated, as are men immigrants. The U.S. economy has changed. The labor markets have changed, and with it, both men and women immigrants have changed. I think in our discussions about immigrant workers, we tend to actually to forget that some of them are highly educated and highly trained. In fact, one of the most common ways to immigrate to the United States for both men and women actually today, unlike the past, is to begin as an international student and then to transform your status. Once you are trained and there is an employer who wants to hire you. That happens for both immigrant men and women. Overall, however, the largest group of immigrants entering the United States today do enter with visas that are for family unification. But that does not mean that they are not working once they get here. Of course, they are.
You talked about of us looking for people who are more highly educated, but what does ethnicity and religion, maybe even age, have to do with our immigration policy in this country? Who do we discriminate against?
In theory, since 1965, the United States does not discriminate on the basis of race. It passed new immigration laws in 1965 to eliminate what were called the national origin quotas or
but we
blocks.
have quotas, don't we?
We have different kinds of quotas. We have a fixed number for family unification. We have a fixed number for refugees since the Refugee Act of 1980, right? There's 50,000 visas for refugees each year. We have a fixed number for labor migrants. And it's really about those quotas, if you want to call them that current policy debates focus. There's different opportunities to migrate for people from different countries. I mean, there's 30,000 visas basically for every country around the world. And some countries use up those visas immediately. And then
every country, I'm learning this, every country has the same number.
This was the alternative to sifting on the basis of race. Well, we're going to make all countries equal. Well, some countries are big and some are little. Some have a strong desire, a population with strong desire to migrate, and others could care less. That was one of the reasons that the U.S. created a diversity lottery where, to encourage people to migrate from countries that weren't sending anyone.
300,000 per?
No, 30,000.
13,000. 30,000, I'm sorry. 30,000 per country.
And then certain numbers for 10,000 for low, sort of blue-collar workers, and then another set aside for people who can invest money or who are highly educated. It's an incredibly complex system. Plus, in addition to that, certain members of families can enter above and beyond those numerical limits. And it's there, of course, that many women take advantage of that unification visa option. They're not limited in numbers in the same way.
And then there are visas for geniuses, and I read today about special visas for chefs, special chefs. You know, there are all chefs.
Right.
that you can't find in this country.
And it's tremendously important to remember that none of this really existed before 1880 or 1920.
That's right.
Most of the migrants of the 19th century carried no identity paper. They carried no passport. They required no visa. That is introduced beginning in the 1870s and 1880s and extended
Actually, it was in
to
around, yeah.
increasing numbers of migrants. And both men and women, of course, make decisions based on their perception of how that sifting system works.
You have to remember, after the Civil War, the states actually went overseas and they were recruiting immigrants. They would say, Michigan, come to Michigan. We'll give you free land and you don't have to pay taxes. Or Texas would do that. And so they were going to Germany and Britain or the Scandinavian countries. So, because the country needed people, you know, to build the railroads, to build our country. It wasn't, and then we had this huge influx of immigrants between 1880 and 1920. And then it was around 1921 that we started the quota system. In 1924, I believe it was the Hate Seller Act. 1924, we had the Hate Seller Act, where you really had the quota system that dominated immigration policy till 1965, I believe. And that's when we started having the family reunification acts.
And what kind of immigrants does a country want to welcome? Does it want to privilege families? Does it want to privilege asylum for refugees who are seeking help? Or does it want to privilege workers, high-end workers, low-end workers? And how do you accomplish that when you set a numerical limit?
You have a question, and actually there's a microphone there now, I see. So.
What shifted between 1880 and 1920? Was it that it was...
There was a huge influx. What happened? It's very...
It was too urban.
Well, there was this huge...
20s as Red Scare.
All of those things.
Well, yes, and there was all this huge influx. And what always happens, I think, people are different, and people get scared, and suddenly you had something called the Dillingham Commission, where people actually thought they were doing research that showed that immigrants from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe were genetically inferior. People actually believed this.
And so our topic is immigrant women, so it might be interesting to think about what shifted in Americans' perception of women during that period of time, right? It wasn't the case, for example, that Americans imagined immigrant women as bomb-throwing anarchists, the way they imagined Italian. And it was the case that they imagined Asian women as diseased and prostitutes. And the focus of what's called nativism or xenophobia and even racism in discussions of immigration between 1880 and 1920, when it focused on women as bearers of children, and especially on bearers of too many children in comparison to white, middle-class, English-speaking women. You may recall Theodore Roosevelt talking about race suicide. He looked at the numbers and he said, American women are not having babies, and all of those immigrants are having lots of babies, and they're going to replace us. They're going to out-reproduce us. So when the focus was on women, nativists were concerned much more about women as reproducers and as bearers of inferior children who they wouldn't raise properly than they were about their political activism or even about their wage earning patterns.
The period from 1880 to 1920 coincides with the Progressive Era, which is the longest period of social reform in history and very effective in the United States, and women were behind much of the social reform leading up to getting the right to vote in 1920, but we were behind all sorts of things. And actually, immigrant women were involved in a lot of those social reform movements in helping the women in their clubs, the upper class women in their clubs who were paying for and helping organize all of these movements. So I just wondered if that affected women's desire to come to the United States, if they're writing back and telling their relatives what's going on, and or if it affected our policy towards letting them in, since they were troublemakers.
It's a really important and really complicated and interesting question. On the one hand, I think all of those progressive women, the American women, believed that coming to the United States could be emancipatory for immigrant women. But ironically, they also, as leaders of the progressive reform movement, founded the schools and the home economics programs and the social settlements that taught immigrant women that they shouldn't be working for wages, that they should learn how to keep a proper American house and stay home. There's a very strong pattern in US history, and I'd be interested to hear Diane talk about what she thinks about this pattern today. Very strong pattern of American women seeing themselves as the big sisters of immigrant women and seeing immigrant women as needing their help. I have a friend who once said, men are seen as causing problems, immigrant men are seen as causing problems, immigrant women are seen as having problems, and those problems American women believe they can help them to solve. And ironically, this sometimes results in those progressive reformers seeing their enemy as being the immigrant man who mistreats, who oppresses, and who places limits on women.
I'm curious to know what you think when we look at discrimination in ethnicity and religion with immigrants who were coming in. Did women experience the same amount of discrimination as men did?
I think, and sometimes I think even more.
Really?
In some cases, yes. I don't think people even realize that there were actually laws on the books until 1930 that a woman's citizenship was derived from her husband. So if a woman, for example, if a woman was a citizen and married a non-citizen, she lost her citizenship.
One of the special problems that women faced at the border from the 1880s onward was if she did travel alone or if she did travel with a child without a man present, she was often in danger of being seen as immoral, but also as, it's a special category of immigration law, liable to become a public charge. In other words, she might need charity, or today I guess we would say welfare. How could she take care of herself? And in fact, although the rates of being turned away at the borders of the United States in the past were relatively low, they were about twice as high for women as for men. And that was largely because of this liable to become a public charge fear, that a woman without a man would not be able to support herself and her children.
And women are also vulnerable to sexual abuse, to rape. They can be abused by their spousal abuse as well. So, you know, there's that added on too. When I came to this country, and I came to Ellis Island with my mother, and I was sick, I was almost turned away because I was sick. And I'm still convinced, because I had blonde hair and blue eyes, that I wasn't turned away. Instead, we were quarantined at the Ellis Island Hospital, and eventually, obviously, I got better, and they let me out. But
I've talked about the perspective of the progressive women, saying, you know, American can be emancipatory for women. Immigrant men also perceived the United States as a place where women ruled frequently. And they saw what, you know, because there's a famous story among German immigrants that American women don't work in the fields. They just sit on the front porch and rock their rocking chairs while the men do all the work. What a great country for women, and what a lousy country for men. For German men then in the 19th century, there was a close eye on the women of their group. Would they claim the privileges of American ladyhood and domesticity or not? And whether or not that translates into more oppressive conditions at home, frankly, we don't know and probably can't know. But the impression that a modern America was somehow going to result in the emancipation of women was both something fervently believed by American women and feared by immigrant men. And surely that affects women's adjustment once they arrive in the United States. Today, I would argue America is perceived as a country with weak families that celebrates individuals, and that too poses a challenge to immigrants' more family-oriented and collective cultures. So what is the immigrant girl going to do? Is she going to be like an American girl and insist on wearing short skirts and going on dates and choosing her own husband? Or is she going to respect values that hold daughters close, that expect parents to be involved in the arrangement of marriages, as many cultures have been historically? What are her choices? Which of those choices will she make? American women are watching her very closely, and so are her parents, and so are her brothers and fathers, because women are seen as the key to cultural survival. Mm-hmm. I knew I'd get to that point.
I think there was another question back here.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. My name is Dara Baldwin, and I work for the National Disability Rights Network. And thank you for mentioning all the groups, and you talked about people being discriminated against. People don't talk about people with disabilities and women with disabilities who come to this country. And when we wrote VAWA, the Violence Against Women, when you were saying that, the way the Hill people, staffers talked about immigrant women, because that was one of the provisions the House stopped or tried to stop, it was really sad. And then to think that a disability organization would be in solidarity for that, because they didn't believe, I was like, what makes you think that women come here with disabilities, or they get a disability, especially if they're the victim of a violent crime? So I was just wondering if you had any talk about women with disabilities, and children with girls with disabilities.
Quite frankly, in the past, in the 19th century, such people were simply turned away. They were not admissible. Physical and mental handicaps or disabilities or other abilities were simply grounds for exclusion. It was as simple as that. I actually don't know how that works in the present, but I know how it worked in the past.
I think that was a very good question. I'm curious to know if it's still, if we still see this happening.
I'll just say that undocumented children that you heard about this summer, that 90% of them are children.
Didn't the law read women and imbeciles as far as exclusions? There was a phrase in the law that defective people included imbeciles and women.
I'm not sure about that.
I don't know.
I don't think that's the case. My reading of law, at least in the past, was that, and it's true in the present as well, there's been a striving for a kind of gender neutrality, even during a period of time when racial categories were openly used in a very discriminatory fashion. Unaccompanied women were liable to exclusion because of this public charge. But I don't think there's a direct comparison between women and imbeciles.
Diane, what have been some of the main skills that immigrant women have brought to this country, and what about today?
Today, the skills that they bring
over the years, and let's go up to what we're seeing today.
Well,
particular skills. Anything that
Well,
cooking,
when you look
sewing?
at the past, when they came in, whether it was domestic skills, they always took care of our children. They always took care of families. They were the ones that worked in the factories. They worked the farms. But we certainly, as I mentioned before, we're certainly seeing more skilled women coming in today. But I want to mention something else, because the government and everyone else is talking about they want to focus so much on skilled people who are educated and people who are skilled. But when you're talking about family reunification, and when you're talking about the importance of women and keeping the family together, and I've seen this over the years with the school. When I first opened the school, it was after Eastern Europe opened up, and most of our students, women students, were highly educated. Today, we have many students, for example, from the Middle East. We have many students from Haiti. And we have many women who never had the opportunity, or they were never permitted to go to school. So they are illiterate. And so now, for the very first time in their lives, they have the opportunity to learn how to read and write. Can you imagine? They've never even had the opportunity to go to school. And they're smart, and their children are smart.
And these women who go and apply for a visa to come to this country have no problem as long as there are under 13,000 visas handed out.
30, I think.
30.
I don't know the exact numbers.
It's
About 30, she said, I'm not going to, because I don't know the numbers. And of course, I think Haiti was...
But what are the chances of a woman who has never been to school to go to the
So
visa
we have a
office of the United
literacy
States?
program. So we have a very specific literacy program where these women have never learned to read and write, even in their native languages. And yes, they do learn how to read and write. They learn how to read and write in English. And they do find jobs, and some of them then even go on to volunteer at the school to teach others how to read and write. And I have wonderful stories about their children who do very well at school, and they get scholarships, and their children who are women go on to Bryn Mawr or UMass Boston, things like that. So there's a whole other element here of you have women also who also have to have this opportunity. These women are important. And also when you're talking about entrepreneurs, you have to remember that immigrants also are twice as likely to start businesses as the native born, also all kinds of businesses, whether it's the little local grocery store or restaurant or the Fortune 500 companies. And these entrepreneurs tend to be family-owned businesses, and women are very much involved in that.
But to have the opportunity to immigrate, we don't require that a person come with enough money to take care of themselves when they come here. They can come with nothing.
No.
Well,
one of the purposes of family unification is, of course, to insert people into existing families where there are existing wage earners. Can I return to your question, though, about special skills that women bring?
Yeah, I'd like to hear.
Because I think if we're looking for special occupational skills, women and men often bring comparable levels of skills which are appropriate for the job market that they're seeking to enter in the United States. When I think about the special skills that immigrant women bring to the U.S., these are skills that I would call people skills. If a language is going to survive in the United States, it's not going to survive because men found a newspaper. It's going to survive because women have the love and respect of their children who want to continue to talk to them in their native tongue. If other cultural gifts from abroad, whether it's food or arts, are going to survive in the United States, it's often women in their domestic roles that guarantee that continuation and survival. To the degree that the children of immigrants must figure out a new country, must make the transition from their native tongue to English when they go to school, it's largely women who help them to make that transition. These are the skills of women and American women as well, right? Domestic role, motherhood, love, mothering, and tongue. But in the context of immigration, more is demanded of the immigrant woman because there are language changes, there are changes in educational systems. Women frequently have also been the point of intersection between immigrant families and I guess what we would call social services today, who takes the child to the doctor, who manages, in many cases, the family's money. In many immigrant families, it's the woman. And those are what I think of when I think of the special skills to both for themselves and for their families, navigate the very complex process of cultural change, of language change, of shifting ideas of what a boy should be, what a girl should be, what a mother should be, what a father should be. Men face that too, but in their roles as mothers and as people who are highly responsible for family well-being and survival.
Yeah, they
Those
really,
are the special skills that I would
especially navigating
emphasize.
the educational system and our health system is really vital.
The majority of immigrants coming into this country who are not highly skilled now, do they come to visit and stay, or do they come planning to live here?
I don't want to answer that question.
No, I mean, it's very hard to know what's in the heads of people. But no, I will say something.
Statistically, you must be able to tell
I will say
what happens.
something, and here the evidence is absolutely clear. Until the United States fortified its southern border, Mexicans circulated. They traveled back and forth.
So
They
did
came,
Americans, by the way.
and so did Italians.
Yeah.
Lots of other migrants in the past. Circulation and not immigration has been a very important part of U.S. immigration history. Members of my family went back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean for 5 generations, or 4 generations, and I was the 4th of those generations. So it's very clear that until the border was fortified, there was a great deal of circulation. Once the border was fortified, when people came, they came to stay, because they knew if they went home, they might not ever get in again.
Is the border fortified for everyone? Can't some people from some countries come at will? There's not a visa required to get in the United States?
A visa is required
from every country?
Of every country in the world. And if you interview Northern Europeans who seek to come to the United States, they will tell you it's so much work to get into the United States. It's so much work to talk to any immigration lawyer about their clientele, and they will tell you it's just complicated for almost everyone.
I hear that from people from some countries. But England, do they have to go stand in line for days and days and go back 3 days later and a month later and keep returning to get a visa to come here?
If they have it depends what kind of visa they get, but if their student visa requires them to return home, they have to go home too.
Any other questions? Yes. We have a mic coming your way.
Hey, I'm an English immigrant, a new one. I came in January this year, and one of the things that I had to do to get into the country was have an examination of my external genitalia. I also had to get a letter from my doctor to say that I'd never tried to kill myself. Most of the questions that I had to answer revolved around my sexual health and my mental health. There was no appreciation, say, if I'd had in the past an addiction to drugs or an addiction to alcohol and then I'd sought help for that. I would have been penalised for that on the visa that I came on. And listening to you talk about how things have changed over the decades and this sort of, you describe it as a sieve and how way back in the day there were people, so-called undesirables, that were perceived to be diseased or it doesn't seem to me that much has changed. And I wonder if you think that will ever change. People are often surprised when I mention the whole examination thing. They think, oh, God, does that still happen? It definitely does. And I'm from a country that, I would hate to think what some people have to go through from different countries that aren't so sort of, the UK, it's a pretty safe bet, isn't it, that I'm gonna get in. But, yeah, I just wondered your opinions on that.
The evidence is very clear that in the 80s, the United States excluded anyone who had AIDS, right? Medical exams are part of immigration to every country in the world. I've just moved to Canada. I'm going to have a medical exam.
She even has to take an English test.
I'm going to have to take an English test soon. stacks of requirements that have to be fulfilled. There's several dozen different kinds of visas. Getting through the system is not simple. The application process can be prolonged and require visits to consuls in distant cities. In many countries of the world, it can involve paying bribes. Perhaps not in the UK, I would hope, but I know in other countries that is the case. There's medical concerns. There are concerns about where your income is, what kind of work you may be able to do, whether or not you will become a public charge is, I believe, still on the books. And at the same time, we have a public discourse that does believe, and a public that often does believe that, but some people can just walk in with no, the only people who just walk in are people who haven't been able to get a visa. I'll be blunt.
Therefore,
and why would they be turned down?
Therefore, if you're an immigrant, you are a very special person. You've gone through all this. You are a risk taker. You're probably a very hard worker. You've been willing to go through all this. So I say to every one of my students, and I say to every one of these immigrants, thank you for coming to America. We need you. Thank you for your children. Always.
Oh, are we already done?
No.
I think this went pretty. Do we have immigrants with us today? Any immigrants in the audience?
Obviously, we have a student.
Thank you. My accent very bad, I know. I hope you understand me. I am older than a young woman, 53 years old I am. And excuse me, okay. When I was Turkey, my generation, very difficult politic problem in 1980, and then very close community. We never go to another country. We never thinking go to another country also. New generation really lucky. Also my son, he stayed high school here and university, PhD, and now professor university. I am also PhD, but still I don't have work. Sometimes go to Turkey, come to here, 2 countries between, go and come back. And I know, very difficult. The choice, my choice, and I would like to I want to leave the country. I felt me close, and I want to melt the kettle inside, you know. And then, but more, there is very difficult. If you're old, to learn English, very difficult, you know, perfect skill. Because my background only German, not English, and only try to learn myself. And age difficult. I have a degree, PhD. Okay, I can work. Every work very I cannot work. Very important, and only work important, you know, take myself, control yourself. It is important. But when I go to any area for my education and you know, equal something, language barrier is very difficult. I don't know. Just immigrant women need independent life, one. Two, the more important job. Three, more important health care. I don't have any health care now. God bless me. If I go to Turkey, I have. If emergency, Turkey give me some help, here. Mm-hmm. But, for example, my eyes problem, my headache. No, I never go to hospital. This is difficult.
It is.
Any other, healthy life, safe, healthy life. Because some women like me alone here, not any family. This is difficult, also.
I can tell we have a lot to talk about here.
Thank you so
Maybe
much.
we should, I think they want to close the program, and then we can all talk with each other. I learned a lot today. This is not, I've been working on Ebola and everything else. Immigration has not been the thing, but I have many questions, and I was actually talking with one of our reporters at MSNBC the other day, and he was just saying that we do need our immigration policy to be broadened. We need our immigrants. We need to continue to build our country.
Well, we are a nation of immigrants,
right.
And it's who we are. So yes, yeah. We do. And immigrants always have and continue to bring so much into the country. It's who we are.
Well, thank you, Diane.
Well, thank you, all
Donna.
of you. It's a pleasure to all of you.
It's nice to have all of you here. I'm really impressed that you all got here tonight. Maybe you just live across the street.
That's quite possible.
I came a little bit of a distance and a lot of traffic, but I'm so glad that I got to be with you tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara.
And we're very glad that you got to be with us as well, and all of you here in the audience. My name is Liz Maurer, and I'm the Director of Program for the National Women's History Museum. And on behalf of the museum and George Washington University History Department and the committee sponsoring the event, we'd like to thank Diane and Donna and Barbara for joining us this evening for this excellent conversation.
Thank you.
However,
thank you so much.
I'm going to give the concluding remarks, though, as a summary. Right.
You guys, I know you teachers.
Say that the history of immigration in the U.S., or the U.S. is the history of immigration, and women have been part of that story from the 57 young maids who arrived in Jamestown in 1620 as brides to the gentlemen of the fort. And today, women's decisions to immigrate have been as varied as their individual stories. Today, over time, many we've learned, as family groups or as family reunification. They've come for jobs, they've come for opportunities. During the 19th century, when the states were actually actively recruiting people to populate what was seen as vast open spaces to filling very necessary jobs. We learned that the types of jobs have had very much of an impact on who comes and when they come. We've learned that the sifting policy has been in effect from the 19th century until today, and that's part of that family reunification, but also the economic motivations for who comes and who stays. So as a nation, we see that the issues of immigration are cyclical, that they represent the continuity and change of our culture, including economic, social, family, language, and education. And we admire and applaud the women who have made these very difficult, life-changing decisions to come to America and for themselves and for their families. And now we'd like to invite you all to enjoy our lovely reception.
Thank you.